Hi guys, Pingow here. Welcome to another episode of New Falmouth. We're on episode 9 this week, which is a bit of a milestone. This is as far as I got to with Santa Caprizia. I didn't get as far as episode 10, so this is already now tying in terms of the position of how far I've got with a city or city series. So that's good. It can only get better. Hopefully I'll get an episode 10 soon. And in terms of Santa Caprizia, anybody that is interested to know, I have some news which I'll be releasing in the coming days in regards to Santa Caprizia. I'm not going to say anything too much yet, but I do have some news in regards to my previous city, so do stay tuned. But getting back to New Falmouth, this week's episode is going to be really concentrating on the old town, the historical quarter as it's known, which is really the birthplace of the city. It's where the original settlement of New Falmouth was formed and built on, and so it has a lot of older buildings, a lot of history, and it's been quite a fun build to do actually the last week or so. But first of all, just getting to grips with this little square here, which is in the North End district, which was the previous area that I was working on in episode 8, if you'll remember. This is me just finishing off North End because there was a few blocks there that I wanted to get done before moving on to the Old Town, which is what I'm doing here. So the Old Town is wedged in between the North End district to the north and the River Falmouth and the water obviously to the south. And it is positioned at the point where the Falmouth River empties into the Falmouth Bay. So it's the point where the river becomes the sea in effect. A very important strategic position, not only from a defensive position, which back in the day was quite important, but also from a practical perspective. The harbour is quite deep here, which meant that ships could dock quite easily without running aground, and it meant that the town naturally began to be built and planned around this area. Now, the harbour itself I'm not going to be building today, so do bear in mind that there is a big harbour that I need to build immediately next to the old town, but that's something that will have to wait until maybe episode 10 or 11. At this stage I really wanted to just work out the kind of nuts and bolts of the old town itself. You will see as it progresses that there is no real plan to this build. It's very much organically designed because back in the day it would have been like that. I mean, the old sort of towns of the Americas and Europe as well were fairly unplanned. I mean, particularly European cities, medieval in origin, many of them. So the road networks and the kind of map of the cities were quite confusing jumble of different avenues and roads and streets and so forth. And in many respects, New Falmouth was inspired more by the European cities of the day rather than anything in America, which means it's quite unusual because it does have quite a chaotic jumble of different roads, which is one of the reasons it is a nice area, because it is a little bit more interesting than the usual sort of grid format which you'll be seeing elsewhere in New Falmouth. And it also meant that a lot of the buildings here that I've been putting down have been an absolute nightmare to try and get them to fit on the blocks, because every single block is different. So I couldn't just copy and paste them. I had to literally move everything and get them into position and try and find buildings that worked with the angles and stuff. So it was a long build. In fact, this build has taken me probably longer than any other build. You are going to be seeing a considerably condensed version of what I've been doing over the last week and a half or so, because there's so much video that I wouldn't have enough time to put even half the stuff I wanted to do out. And to be honest with you, it could probably take up about 3 or 4 episodes, the build on this, but I just felt that I don't want to just prolong it. I want to be able to show you the old town pretty much completed today, so that we can move on to the next phase, because I have so many ideas for New Falmouth and I do need to focus a little bit. So let's talk about the history a little bit more, because I like to try and work out the history of the city that I'm building. I think it helps when you've got something in your head, how the city was in the day, how it was planned, and its own history, what it used to be like. And that can influence the actual build itself, and particularly the fact that this would have been a city founded around the end of the 17th century. So about 1680, 1690 was when the first settlers built New Falmouth, and at that time it would have been a collection of timber frame buildings. Much of those are no longer with us. Unfortunately, they have, as many cities go over the years, been demolished or burnt down. So much of the old town is actually much later than that, so would date more from the Victorian era and also the early 20th century era. So in terms of an old town, it's certainly nothing like the typical European old town, which would often be medieval in origin. I mean, we are talking about America here, so it is more modern certainly than European, but nevertheless the old town is still old from an American perspective, and it is quite unusual in that you've got all these little roads and lots of small pedestrian paths and things like that. So the old town has very much a kind of a more personal feel or personal scale to it, and this building I'm putting down here is in fact what I imagine to be the oldest building in New Falmouth, and I'm calling this the Governor's Residence, and I imagine this was one of the very first big mansions to be built in the city, sort of early 18th century, that sort of era, around 1720s, something like that. And the Governor's Residence is obviously where the Governor of New Falmouth lived. These days, as many of these sort of old houses it is now a museum. It's no longer a private residence. It houses the New Falmouth Historical Society and Museum. So if you're interested in the history of the city, then I would suggest going to visit the Historical Society's museum in the old mansion. Next door to the Governor's Mansion is the old Christ Church, and this is one of the oldest, well, it is the oldest church in the city, and also one of the oldest buildings in the city as well. And it dates from around the mid-18th century, that sort of period. It's undergone a few changes over the years, and it burnt down at one point, so what you see here is a little bit later building, but nevertheless the foundations and the design of the church is pretty much as it was when it was first built, sort of 250 odd years ago, I think. Work that out mathematically, I don't know. But anyway, it's an old building, so there we go. And it's quite a nice little sort of church. Here sits on the corner here. What I wanted to do was add some lots of props and bits of detail to this church, because it's quite a key sort of landmark. I mean, it's not a major landmark in the city, but for the old town it is one of the main sort of landmarks, and I imagine it would be quite a popular place for tourists to have a little look in and wander around the graveyard, which is something that tourists like to do when they're on holidays. Not sure why, but there we go. So this is me just sort of making sure that the graveyard actually gives me enough space to get a little path in so that the people can wander about and have a look at the graves. So I wanted to do a few of these historical sort of buildings, but most of the architecture you'll see in the old town, as I say, is dating more from the sort of Victorian mid-19th century onwards, and there's quite a lot of 20th century architecture as well. There's quite a few sort of brownstone apartment blocks and things like that. Nothing particularly dramatic. I guess 2, 3, 4 stories at most of the buildings. Luckily, the old town did have a conservation notice slapped on it back in the 1950s, which meant a lot of the older buildings were not only retained, but it meant that any new buildings had height restrictions, things like that, applied to them. So there's no skyscrapers or anything particularly overbearing in the old town. It retains a lot of its original charm. And that's something to bear in mind. The history of cities, sometimes with the older parts of the cities, you do find more modern buildings have been built because maybe the conservation notices and things like that weren't as strict back in the day. And sometimes modern architecture encroaches, and it can sort of change the sort of atmosphere of the city. But New Falmouth has retained a lot of its older buildings, and that's something that I quite enjoyed sort of doing, which is what I'm doing here, putting these sort of Georgian era or early Victorian houses in. So that's a little bit of the history of the old town of New Falmouth. The other thing about this build is the fact that it's taken me a long time, not only because it's quite complex work. I mean, you can see here what I'm having to do is convert this house to PO and then start tweaking it and adjusting and the roofs and everything to get everything working. Not only because of that and the fact that every block is different, so I can't just copy and paste stuff. I have to actually work out what's going to fit where, but also the fact that the game has been, well, causing me a headache, let's just say, over the last few weeks really. Ever since probably episode 7, I've had issues with the game loading or not loading, as the case may be, and I've been suffering that a lot. What I have managed to do, however, is track down what I believe to be the problem. Now, first of all, I kind of thought it might be the 81 tiles mod, and I still have that deactivated because I'm still not sure if that's also causing issues. But what does or has been causing me a lot of issues has been ploppable Reco. Now, not only did I get issues with the game not loading or loading after about 3 attempts, but also I've had an error message popping up after placing down a certain amount of buildings using Reco. And the error message I tracked down online to be a potential issue with Reco. So the advice was to take Reco off, and the error message sometimes disappears. Well, not only has the error message disappeared, but also the loading problem now seems to have disappeared as well. So fingers crossed, touch wood and everything else, it looks like I might have found the problem. I mean, I don't want to speak too soon, but it's been a few days now, and so far I haven't had a single problem with the game, which is quite unusual, I've got to be honest, because I just seem to be having so many problems with City Skylines recently that I have seriously considered just leaving the game and doing some other kind of project, just because I was getting so frustrated with the thing not working for me. But now, as I say, it does seem to be working. So if it's anybody out there that's having problems, I would suggest just checking your mods and making sure that, particularly Reco, does seem to cause a few conflicts. I'm now using Plop the Growables and Find It in order to track down the relevant buildings, and using Find It is fine. I wasn't sure about Find It first of all. I use it a lot anyway, but I've used Find It now purely for all my buildings, just searching through that, and generally it works pretty well. And over hundreds of times of using it now, you get to know where the buildings are and what sort of terms to search for and so forth. So I think going forward, it's going to be as easy now using Find It and Plop the Growables as it was using Ploppable Rico. So I don't intend to go back to Rico. So that's really good news for the city. It means that I can carry on with what I'm planning to do for it, and also hopefully speed up my workflow, because the reason it's been taking me so long is just the fact that half the time the game either didn't load or decided to crash halfway through, and therefore I was just getting to the point where, you know, doing anything and even attempting to do any kind of recording of the gameplay was it was just a mess, because I was having to redo bits of the city, take buildings away, start again from scratch, this, that and the other, and in the end I just thought that I just couldn't be bothered with it. But luckily, finding this solution going forward, I'm feeling really positive now, and I'm really enjoying the game. Really enjoying the build, and I've got, as I say, lots of exciting things lined up for New Falmouth. Hopefully you will enjoy. I'm not going to say too much yet, but I've got lots of plans in the pipeline, and lots of inspiration, so that's really good. What I'm doing here, in case you wonder, is a little pedestrian street, and this is quite a detailed part. I mean, this took me a few hours to sort of put in, and I've had to heavily edit this video. It doesn't look like much work, but believe me, trying to make all those buildings, shape them and tweak them in PO was so time consuming. But anyway, the end result looked pretty good, I think. You'll see a lot of these in the cinematics at the end, which I'm doing a lot of street level cinematics because I think it's pretty good. I'm pretty pleased with how the old town turned out. I wasn't sure when I was building it, and it's strange when you're up in the sky like this building something. You can't really tell what it feels like when you're actually in the city, which is a funny thing to say, but I think these builds all have their own atmosphere, and especially when you're doing a lot of this detail work, when you see it down at street level, it really comes to life and sort of has its own atmosphere, I think. And you can see here when I'm just trying to sort of place these lamps and things in, trying to get an idea of how it looks at street level. The other thing I'm doing as well is a bit of lighting, which is something I don't usually do, but for this build I am putting some lights and spotlights and things in like that. But one of the key things for me with doing the old town was to get some nice street level cinematics, which you'll be seeing some first person cinematics at the end of the video, so do stick around for those, guys. It's well worth waiting to see. It gives you a different sense again of how the old town works. But anyway, I'm nearly at the end of the video. I've been rabbiting on for the last 20 minutes, virtually non-stop, and my mouth is dry and I need a drink. So I am going to say goodbye, and I hope you enjoy the cinematics. I hope to get another video out in a week or so. Hopefully, as I say, it's going to be a little bit quicker now, just because of my workflow has speeded up, thanks to sorting out some of the glitches with the game. So until next time, do like the video, do subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you in episode 10. Stay safe. Cheers, guys.